Hello and welcome back to Church of Entropy live streams. Really glad to be back before our usual weekly show, Sunday Night Week in Review. I am joined by Gandalf for a School of Entropy teaching session where we are going to be talking about mostly the people who came up with theories that helped me build my theory. So that is what's in store for today. It was Gandalf's idea to do the show, and I thought it was a good one. So why don't you fill us in, Gandalf? I'm just going to share the link to the stream, so if you could blab for maybe 2 minutes, let us know how you're doing and what we're going to be talking about today.
Well, I'm doing quite well. I've been a little bit out of streaming because I relocated from Chicago. It was good to get out of the city. Obviously, things are in decline there for all sorts of reasons we don't need to talk about. But, I'm eager to get back into streaming. I've got 1 or 2 blog posts up, and I got to get that going much more. I'm kind of in a cool, relaxed place. It's, the world's just going to keep getting crazier, but it's important that you're the eye at the center of the storm as much as possible, and I'm working hard on doing that myself. I'm Spiritual Mamser. Happy Gandalf is here. Duvid and Jen gets boring after a while. Well, I hope I provide good entertainment. I mean, you're not going to get Shitler rants from me very often, it seems, right now. Just, but I'm pretty cool when I'm calm. You know what I mean? But we got an exciting episode for you today. I discussed this with Church offline a couple hours ago, and it's an excuse to get out my old Encyclopedia Britannicas, for that matter. And we're looking at kind of the trajectory of the history of thought. Now, this is one part of history which is not taught very well at all. Interestingly, the two areas I would reform in historical education, and this is relevant, by the way, the show we're about to do, would be political history, obviously, political and diplomatic history. I mean, that's hardly ever taught. But the second thing, which is probably even more important, is the history of thinking. Seeing if we can determine the various patterns and narrative arcs of how we came to believe in certain conceptions of reality, for lack of a better term. And so studying the intellectual history of a lot of, Western science and whatnot helps reveal a certain kind of destiny for, the remnants of the West, for lack of a better term. And why, I'm kind of, when I did that whole QST kind of LARP, why I've always been interested in, much more scientific, futuristic government. But a kind
Yeah,
of
just
government.
like thinking back, like I know you didn't go to school for math, but you said
Yeah,
you did do calculus, correct?
yeah, that's kind of about my limit, is basic calculus.
Basic calculus. So, were you ever taught about the people who invented it?
No.
Yeah, I remember, like, I'm interested in that kind of stuff, so maybe I just had more, like, it stuck with me more, but I don't know at what point we started learning about history. I know in university we did learn some history, like, we learned people's names, especially in my nuclear physics class. I think the prof was really interested in history, so we went into that quite a bit, but generally, there's no context given. It's just like, "This person came up with this thing." And there's no story told about what that particular discovery meant. It's just one more thing on the never-ending journey towards mathematics that isn't really converging to what you could call an elevated state of consciousness. So it's not interesting, right? Because it's like, I'm gonna go learn some math, and then I'm gonna feel really satisfied with my knowledge, right? Like, there's no real validation to anything. So hopefully with the unified field model, we can validate what a lot of these people were looking for, give some context, and say, like, well, is all just stepping stones to this eventual discovery that, relative to what came before, it's going to seem theoretically very simple in a way, because that's the way it's always looked. Like, it in the distant past, math was very advanced, but it didn't look like it does today. Like, it wasn't these enormously complicated equations that take hours to explain, right? So it's gonna be going back in that direction, but we still wanna sort of tip our hats to the people that, helped us, because I mean, I couldn't have done it alone, and lots of people have tried and failed, so I do wanna kind of tip my hat to them too. But if you want, I can go to the story that I had, because I think what we're gonna do is, like, sort of paint this as a human narrative discovery of computation. Generally, like, what does it mean to compute? So Gandalf, why don't you tell us, when I say computation, how would you define that term? What do you think about?
The ability to aggregate data, recognize patterns, apply logic and axioms, and then come up with results.
Right. So what's data? What's a pattern? What are axioms? So right there, you're sort of getting to the point, is that it's actually really hard to define, give good definitions for these terms that are so commonplace, right? Like, who doesn't own a computer? But
Yeah.
what is a computation, right? It turns out to be kind of on the order of what is consciousness as a question to answer foundationally. So I just kind of wanted to break it down in this cool diagram, or sorry, PowerPoint that you can access on schoolofentropy.wordpress.com. It's computation theory 1, just a short slideshow. I just really wanted to go through the major ideas. So numbers, just we're kind of taking a trip back to, like, when we was apes, right? So I was in a convo with Quebecois foie gras before this show started, and he's like, well, what's the big deal with India? What about before India? And I was like, well, you're talking pre-civilizational, right? Like, you're talking about, out of Africa type stuff. It's like, do you want to talk about that? Well, let's talk about it. Okay, so back, let's say, before quote unquote civilization, did we have the idea of numbers? Well, we could maybe argue that when we started using numbers is sort of when we started having civilization, because our thinking was formalized enough that we could relate to each other through these abstract concepts called numbers, and we could agree as to what the interpretation was, like trading 5 coconuts for, take your pick, a fish. There's a sort of abstraction there where you're equating. You're saying, if I add 2 to 3, it's the same as if I add 1 to 4. That's a relational equivalency, a very simple one, but the fact that we could use numbers is sort of what distinguishes us, because it opens up this other universe, abstract universe, that contains multiple infinities of these numbers that we can't see in material reality, but that we can agree as to what they mean. So the next major discovery after this would be zero, which is it's in the same sort of domain, but it's another level of abstraction, because rather than this numerical archetype that has an analog in reality, you're taking a numerical archetype that doesn't have an analog in reality, because like, what's 0 bananas? It's just nothing, right? 0 anything is 0. So that's another conceptual leap. And then you go into negative numbers, which is basically like a reflection of the positive numbers, and you're increasing the abstraction yet again. And we have a bunch of these sort of stepwise conceptual leaps that we made throughout our history. Geometry, for example. So the idea that something has a particular density, and that density will displace an equivalent volume, whatever the law is. I forget exactly what it is, these trivial laws. I forget them, but there is a connection between volume displaced and density. And those relations are intuitive because geometry is a real thing. Geometrical measurement is then taking these abstract numbers and attaching them to real things, real geometries. And then geometrical modeling, and at that point, we're sort of starting to get into a more abstract understanding of geometry itself. It's no longer an abstract understanding of numbers, it's an abstract understanding of geometry. You didn't really have much in terms of conceptual leaps in the interim. So we could do the first three for a lot of our history. The next big leap was differential and integral calculus, because that gave us a way to prove that within that system, it's the best. It's not just within that system, it's within reality itself that's the best approximation to a continuous system. The question isn't whether calculus is the best approximation. The question is whether reality is continuous. And the answer is, well, no, because it has quantum transitions and they're not continuous, but there is such a thing as continuous entities, or approximately continuous entities. So this calculus thing applies really well, even when it doesn't. And that's a big conceptual leap compared to something as straightforward as, well, how much paint does it take to cover a sphere versus, what is the rate of change of the radius with respect to the volume of a sphere being increased in volume? Significantly more difficult question. So each new method requires you to use all the axioms of the previous methods, and it's an additional step or steps of complexity. So in this next slide, I take a look at what is calculus and why it's so awesome. So you're theoretically zooming into an infinitely small length. And as it turns out, there's a very similar yogic technique to this. So it's like finding these sort of transcendental lessons in mathematics is extremely, at least me, what do you call it? Invigorating. So I tried to make a diagram sort of giving people a flavor of what it tastes like to do derivatives. And why, and well, we're not quite at derivatives yet. We're just talking about how to build the derivative from the limit function, because this is the definition of a derivative. So under the hood of the car of the derivative, you have this limit function that's always sort of clunking away. But the reason why calculus is so great is because it has all these shorthands where you can sort of skip the limiting parts, but it's an important concept, because that's really what the power of calculus is when you need to like zoom into the micro state or go across an entire volume. Because as it turns out, those are like there are two major operators in calculus: differentiation and integration. One deals with rate of change, the other one deals with volume. So here's your formula talking about general derivatives of polynomials. So a polynomial is y equals some function of x in which it's the base x, so it's x to the power of something. So it could be y equals x squared plus 1, y equals 3x cubed plus 2x plus 5, anything like that. That's your polynomial. Great thing about calculus, derivatives of polynomials are extremely simple to compute, because all you do is drop down the exponent as a coefficient and diminish the exponential value by 1. Huge deal. Huge deal. So you're taking something that would normally take a bunch of steps to compute and compressing it down to literally 2 steps. Drop down the exponent as a coefficient and diminish the value of the exponent by 1. That's a derivative of any polynomial. So wow, super cool. Oh my God. Taylor's series, we can approximate literally any function with a polynomial. Oh my God, any function can now be computed, can have its derivatives and integrals computed at a very fast rate. Because remember, these polynomials have super easy to compute derivatives. Taylor series and Maclaurin series are extremely important developments because they allow us to model any function as some polynomials. Well, not any function, but many functions. That's super important because, again, we're coming back to not just computation, but computational efficiency, right? Like hear about Steve Wozniak trying to run a program that he estimated would take 10 to the 25 seconds to finally get an answer. At some point, your computational efficiency is very, very, very important. So we sort of figured out a bunch of stuff about computation, but we realized we're using like super clunky approaches to it. So calculus shortens it right down, and we can do even more computations, which we then realize we're actually ultra clunky now, but we have to do the work in those systems to realize why they're clunky and kind of transcend them. Next, we have the base E, huge development. Very important conceptually because it's a number defined as being equal to its own derivative. So the only base that when you differentiate it, raise to the power of an unknown independent variable, you get the same value back, is the Euler number, which is 2.718. Just going to check back on OBS, make sure this all looks okay. Oh, Conops, what are you doing in the chat? What's going on? I didn't see the deleted comment, Gandalf. What happened?
Just protecting the channel. He's talking about OV and streamers. Apparently, there's a daily, you know what, that goes on over there.
I don't know. I just like the last time I went on a show, it was you were really boring too, Conops. You were like so obviously trying to shift the goalposts to get me to walk into a straw man. And it's like, do you not like, it's so obvious that that's what you're doing. It's kind of like, I feel sorry for you. So my empathy's off the charts. And I'm just like, oh, Conops. He's all like, what did he say? He was trying to paint me as a fanatic because I was unwilling to listen to evidence about the Aryan invasion theory.
Yeah, there is no evidence except what a bunch of 19th century Anglo shills said. And it's obvious they got a lot of things wrong. So what's so hard about that?
I don't know. I guess he just doesn't want to have walked into it that badly, I guess. So why is E important? It may not be obvious for people who don't understand calculus yet, but we're always working with, when we're talking about stuff like quantum mechanics, we're always working with functions and their derivatives and their integrals. In order for the derivatives to be linearly dependent on the functions, which we need because in our own mind, at least, our thoughts make sense to our mind, which means they are coherent. And so since the computations of our mind are operators, quantum mechanical operators, which are modeled by calculus, and we have this requirement that we have to understand our own thoughts, that means that whatever waveform equation for the mind we eventually end up with is going to be in base E. Because base E is the only thing coherent with its eigenvalues, right? It's its own eigenvalue. And we need that because without that condition, we wouldn't understand our thoughts. So this is extremely important. And also the numerical value of E is important because it's approximately 3. So from a information storage perspective, a mind compression perspective, you want 3 elements per archetype canonizer if you can do it. Because 3 is the best way to parse information. Because we know that all the way down the pike of the process of conscious computation, it's basically it's E's all the way down, right? So if you can line up your own thinking with your biological thinking, optimize the potential for information compression. And we talk also about the sinusoidal functions. That's sort of its own domain, but if you're interested to learn more about sinusoidal functions, this is stuff that's readily available online. You talk about things like the sine law, the cosine law. This is all important because a vibrating function can be modeled with a sinusoid, and we live in a vibratory universe. I know that's not a good word. I just don't know what word to use instead. So why don't we continue on with the show? I think I went on a little longer than I said, but I'm glad that I got a chance to talk about this cool subject. And we can go to what Gandalf is going to introduce to us. I'll just grab the... Okay. There we go. Just got to find my internet. I've got Fourier's, the link you sent me about Fourier loaded, but if you want me to put a different one up, just let me know. And I'll hand it over to you, Gandalf.
Put up I'm going to just going to talk about what's in there. It doesn't have a lot of pictures, unfortunately. I mean, I've just been reading for the last couple hours various things. And Fourier is kind of interesting because he was quite involved in political affairs of his day. And it definitely influenced his science. What?
I'm sorry. I just said, woo!
Oh, okay. I was like, oh my God. Were you attacked by something? I don't know.
I was attacked by the ghost of Fourier's awesomeness. Go ahead.
Yeah. So what makes Fourier so awesome to you? I suppose we should ask that question first.
I love his brain. I love his mind. I love what he came up with, basically. It's what I'll do is grab a just like feel like really weird being a fan. I don't know, it's not a fanboy, a fangirl over this, but I'll pull up the Fourier transform because I know that on Wikipedia there's a diagram and it shows why it's really cool. But I worked in signal processing for a while, so that this theory actually ended up being super important to basically everything that I did. Because compression it's not just on via Fourier transforms, but Fourier transforms are an integral part of how compression works, and you have to understand how compression works to do my old job. So he was that's what I liked about it. But why don't you tell us about his political aspirations while I pull up this graph?
Okay. Basically, last 500 years, indeed, much of the last 2,000 years has been. We don't quite have, I think, the right way of looking at it. I mean, when you're taught the history of the last few centuries, you're not taught the history of ideas. You're taught the history of military history in terms of battles and kings and presidents. Maybe you're shown a little bit of art from the past. But in general, people aren't well educated about the kind of ideas that were circulating around at the time. And it's pretty remarkable, considering the fact that corrupt governments and states did a lot to suppress knowledge, that a lot of these men came up with their discoveries in spite of stupefying religion and an oppressive state that was often hostile to scientific inquiry. So I think that's always important to keep in mind, especially when you look at Fourier, because of these major figures, he's probably most tied to what I regard as the most important event in continental Europe in terms of sending it down a terrible road. So that's all I had to say about that as a preview.
Yeah, so it wasn't clear to me what he did politically. Did you have any more info on that?
Well, I'm sorry. He sat on the Revolutionary Committee with Robespierre, and he narrowly avoided getting the guillotine to chop his head off. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Damn. Well, let's go back to his math, and we can talk about what he came up with. So he basically, you have to realize that up until this time, like stuff, people were basically bungling around in the dark. Like it was just, imagine trying to go from knowing so little about technology to knowing so much. And it's always thanks to these people that sort of accelerated the pace of understanding. So the bottom diagram there that I find super illustrative of the power of Fourier's idea is that if you look at, okay, maybe I'll just zoom in a little bit more so it's more clear if I can. Sorry, this thing's a little bit slow, but I just want to make sure everyone can see what I'm talking about because it's a bit. There we go. So if you look at, you have the frequency. So you have an X and a Y axis and a Z axis. The Z axis is the one going up, and X and Y are the ones that are sort of flat. So the Y, you could think of Y as the frequency, and X is kind of covered up by the the label of the X axis is covered up by the Mac computer on the screen there. So anyway, the idea is that, IRL, you have something that is spinning, which is that central blue line with the spokes sticking out of it, or spikes, and the spikes are spinning around. So that's a model of an oscillator. And if you look at the projection on the back wall there, which would be the Z and Y axis, you can see that it's modeled by just a line that's going up and then going down, and then going up and going down. So it's like a way to simplify a complex signal without losing any information. And that's the important thing, is that you're going from frequencies. It's just like a way of mapping frequencies in a way that they are, the information in the frequencies is presented differently. And as it turns out, this ends up being a very powerful tool of analysis. Like the most recent developments, I think, is that they're applying the Fourier, they're doing their computations, whatever computations they're doing, to the Fourier transforms instead of to the original signal. And they're finding that this has improved the efficiency yet again. So anyway, basically all technology is built off of what are called fast Fourier transforms, sine and cosine transforms, same thing. It's just all a way of teasing out information in a signal and presenting it in a way that's computationally easier to deal with. So, yeah, that was all I had to say about Fourier. His thing is just so important that, like, it's one of those things that's so important it's easy to forget how important it is, because you just take it for granted that you can just always put a Fourier, a DCT filter on something, right? That's a computer term. I don't know if Gandalf knows what that is. But anyway,
DCT, what is that?
a discrete cosine transform.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's one of the types of Fourier transforms. Fourier transforms are just like generic signal transforms. Then you have specific types of them that are really applicable, like sine and cosine, because those are your basic oscillator functions. Do you know what a sine function is?
Yeah, sine function is for right triangles, and I think it's the opposite side over the hypotenuse, while the cosine is the adjacent side over the hypotenuse.
That's when you're dealing with a single triangle.
Yeah.
You're talking about a ratio of angles, so that's in a single triangle. But when you're talking about signals, a sine function, I'm going to display it on the screen right now. A sine function is, so like if you can imagine a triangle that was sort of changing shape all the time, but it was inscribed inside a circle. and then the value of the sine curve. The value of the sine would change in this shape. So basically, these curves are the generic basic curves used to model all of the oscillating functions. And because we live in an oscillating universe, it turns out to be very applicable.
Yeah. Supposedly we have 104 people watching right now.
Oh, yeah. It must be Conops. He probably sent some bots to the show. Oh, yeah. Conops now thinks that they're going to make me a meme. It's like, Conops, you're the meme, bro. All right. Well, thank you to all the new people tuning in. If you're real, on the off chance you're real, I really appreciate it. And I hope that it's worth your while. What we're talking about today are a series of European scientists who have contributed to the development of my unified field model. Gandalf, I'm just displaying the image that I sent you. I just feel like I'm just geeking out on this image so much. I never thought that putting all these people together in one diagram would make me so happy. What did you think about, or I guess diagram's the wrong word. What did you think, Gandalf?
Well, what I loved was, who are the three people that had their head in their hands?
Let me think here. Head in their hands. Are you talking about? Yeah, is this? Hang on a second. I got too many things going on at once. Yeah, so you're talking about the third one from the left, right?
On the top row, yeah.
Yeah, see, I've already forgotten his name. This is how good I am at memory. Can you just help me remember?
Starts with a C. I'll think of it. Just give me a second.
If anyone in the audience wants to chip in with number 3 from the left, it's not that I don't know who this is. I do. I just have temporarily forgotten his name.
De Broglie. I can't pronounce it. It's
the
French.
funny thing is that my professor, he was an awesome professor. He taught me intro to quantum mechanics. You know how he used to pronounce his name? De Broglie. Every single time, he would bring it up so much. De Broglie. And I was always looking at the spelling of it. I'm like, is that the actual correct way to pronounce that? But he was French. And, the Quebecers, I didn't want to ask,
Why wouldn't you want to ask Quebecers? I'm missing that reference. I mean, I'm pretty ignorant about the some of the Francophone world is a bit alien to me.
I think they like it that way. Yeah, so I grew up in Quebec as an English person, so you get to a point where you don't want to offend French people, so I didn't say anything. But yeah, so where were we gonna start? Did you want to start with Boltzmann? Because I realized he actually killed himself. Hey, how's it going, Vincent Bruno? Nice to see you.
Yeah, but it's why is very interesting.
Yeah, like these tragic stories, like I think it's important that we explore them because his ideas were so important. He founded thermodynamics, and thermodynamics is literally its own field. Like I took 2 courses in thermo in university, and I know at least one of them, possibly both, were mandatory. And this guy's the one who came up with K ln omega. So he actually came up with a formula for entropy. So the idea of making a formula based on the actual axioms rather than just relations, because you got to realize that up until that point, Le Chatelier is an exception to this, but up until this point, pretty much what people were working with was relational. Okay, like take Archimedes. Do you know the story of Archimedes, Gandalf?
Wasn't he the guy that invented some sort of weapon during the defense of Syracuse?
No, I thought he might be actually. Gandalf knows a lot more about history than I do. But I'm thinking of the guy, and correct me if this is not Archimedes, but the one who sat in a bathtub and ended up deriving some motion law from it. Like he sat in a bathtub, he saw the water rise, and he said, Eureka. I thought that was Archimedes. Maybe I'm wrong. Again, audience, correct me if I'm wrong.
That's the apocryphal story. I mean, I don't know if it actually happened that way. I mean, it's hard to say for sure. Yeah, he was involved in something. Yeah, he was involved during the siege of Syracuse. Um, yeah, and he created a lever that was used for catapults. Yep.
Yeah, so I just wanted to call attention to him as special because his contribution to the field of, gas science or gas I mean gas science, that really doesn't sound right, but I don't know what they called it back then. It was a huge leap forward because up until that point everything was just relational. It's like, well, I got to build this to be this size to balance this out. It wasn't starting from absolute first principles, let's build up field equations for this system, which is what he started to do, which is a far more powerful way to approach things because when you're just doing relations, you don't really know. You can't really answer why, can you? I mean, you can't really answer how either. You just know, well, this is what's happening. There's a relation. Why? Well, the conservation of something. So we have all these conservation laws, and when we come up with them, it's like, wow, what a huge discovery because we're actually able to say something about the universal axioms rather than just something specific to a relation that's like, well, if I push on this lever, the other end goes up. Oh, cool. Versus what Boltzmann came up with, which was like the number of microstates. The macro state is determined by the permutations of the microstate. That idea is so, like, where did he come up with that? It's mind boggling. And he was so, seldom has one man ever been so right in history. Conops is telling me it's Diogenes. Something tells me he is trolling me. So we'll leave that there.
Given that it's con-ops, yes, it's trolling.
I really thought that it was sad that he ended up killing himself because, yeah, that was the story. Did you read up on that story of what happened to Boltzmann? Did you want to tell it?
You tell it because you actually started with it.
I didn't really look into it that deep, but he got ganged up on by people at his college, and because they were basically saying atoms aren't real or something along those lines. They had this theory that was gaining in popularity, which was basically edging him out, or he perceived to be edging him out because his theory was all based on degrees of freedom of some type of atomic type substance, an indivisible particle, as it were. And basically everybody started saying everybody else in the school was like, yeah, those aren't real, bro. And so he killed himself. So I just wanted to say, like, killing yourself will probably just end you getting reincarnated into an abortion. It's not worth it. You can't die. And you never know how things are going to turn around, Look how it ended up. And he unfortunately never got to enjoy much greatness from his own wonderful work, which has now sort of given us entire fields of study. And okay, so we'll go to the next guy. That was all I really wanted to say. Don't commit suicide. It's not worth it. It's not going to change any of your problems, really. It's just going to kick them farther down the line. So the next
Yeah,
guy, go ahead.
Yeah, Boltzmann, he had that one period of about 10 years where he was intensely creative and prolific, but afterwards he kind of petered out quite a bit. I think since there was no way to experimentally validate some of his stuff back then, even though the logic was sound, people just decided to reject everything he said, despite the fact that he probably created theoretical physics as a branch.
Well, what I'm trying to get people to do is to learn to profile truth because it doesn't seem to be happen very often that a big discovery is made that it isn't sort of attacked at the beginning. And people should take it in stride and maybe even take it as a compliment that you were able to arouse this, even though it was a negative reaction. Just you got to think of it as other people's negativity, and the fact that you're arousing it is actually good in the grand scheme of things, because if negativity is suppressed, there's no chance of getting past it. But if it comes to the surface, there's a tiny chance of getting past it, and that's better than nothing. Yeah, so Conops is saying it's Diogenes. Conops, we all know Diogenes is the guy who lived who was the hobo or whatever. We all know that he's your spiritual guru. So the next guy that contributed something really important was Le Chatelier, and he worked in the same type of domain as Boltzmann, and he's the second from the left on the top row. Again, most of what people were doing were relational mechanics. Do you know what I mean when I say relational mechanics?
I think what you're just saying is like, without reference to wider systems, just discussing bodies in motion as related to just each other and nothing else.
Like if I know that it takes 1 tablespoon of salt to make 1 liter of soup, how many tablespoons of salt does it take to make 2 liters of soup?
I'm sorry, I can't. I
You
couldn't.
need to be paying attention and not distracted at all. You are not smart enough that you can do something else while you're talking to me and still maintain. The answer is 2. Okay, I'm explaining what
Oh,
a relational observation is versus a foundational structural observation. So most of these laws that came out were what you call like Boyle's law, Charles's law. These are relational. They're not saying anything about what the underlying substance is. They're just saying, well, this is how the substance behaves. And we have proportionalities. But Le Chatelier was able to unify the understanding into something more profound, which was that any system, whenever something acts on a system, the system will act to minimize the impact of whatever's acting on the system. And they call it a net external force. So basically, you think of it like if you have a balloon, you push on the balloon, the volume of the balloon changes to accommodate the pressure of your finger. And in a way, this is more profound than Newtonian motion laws because it's really going to the core inertia of the universe, the inertia of entropy, if you will, that no matter what's going on, systems are almost like they were actively seeking to minimize the internal energy that they possessed. And Le Chatelier was able to express that in a super condensed way. And yeah, okay, so the next one on the list is de Broglie or de Broglie, if my university professor is to be believed. Do you know what he came up with, Gandalf?
yeah. He came up with the idea that all the subatomic particles have wave-like properties.
Yeah, matter waves. So this turns out to be a really simple formula, but turns out to be something that is basically right out of ancient Indian philosophy. This idea that everything is fundamentally waves. The way that they would be described in the ancient philosophy is that, or mistranslated, that is, would be that everything has a sound. Have you ever heard of this idea?
Well, yeah, oh, yeah, it's harmonics.
Yeah. So the idea that, there's like a fundamental vibrational nature to everything, even words, but also solids and basically everything under the sun.
Isn't this why, say, you've seen it in cartoons? Sometimes I've seen it in reality. Is when an opera singer hits a certain note, a certain kind of glass breaks.
That's a specific effect of matter waves. That's something called beats. Are you familiar with beats?
No.
Beats are actually something that comes out of music. Does anybody in the audience know what beats are? I'll
Oh,
give
like
you a cookie.
musical beat?
Yeah, musical beats as well. Okay,
Oh,
sound is one type of wave, and light is a different type of wave. But yes, they can both produce beats.
okay. I
But
didn't
yeah,
know that note could do that.
it has a specific frequency. Well, beats is a property of waveforms, and since light occurs as a waveform, it must be capable of producing beats. We're just not experts on how that works. So what I'll do is display it. I'll display it. Oh yeah, I saw there's some more viewers on the show. Thank you very much to the new viewers for joining. We usually talk about science, philosophy, and religion on this channel, and I have a unified field model, and I just really like thinking about science and how things work and solving problems. So that's me. And yeah, check out churchofentropy.wordpress.com if you want to learn more. Lots of different articles there. Use the search function to find whatever you might be interested in. It's not just physics. Try to kind of talk about all the things that I think might be conducive to people getting interested in these more complex subjects. Okay, so beats happen when you have two oscillators. Do you know what an oscillator is?
Yeah, just explain what that is.
Do you know what those things that people use when they play pianos?
Those things
Metronomes?
metronomes. Oh, okay, like something that goes by a pendulum motion.
Anything that has a harmonic oscillation is called a harmonic oscillator. And a pendulum is one example. A metronome is another example. But it's basically anything restricted to a particular geometry that has a regular movement of its energetic center through its particular geometry. So this is
That's
literally anything, right? Like anything is a wave form. So anything has frequency, so and so on and so forth. But beats are a particular effect where you have two oscillators that are nearly the same frequency, oscillating in proximity to each other. And this, there's rules to waveforms. For example, they are subject to addition, be added together. And when you add two similar, basically there has to be a phase difference between the oscillators, which means they can't be lined up perfectly. So if there's a bit of a phase difference between the oscillators, they're each creating their own waveform. There's going to be a third waveform created of beats. And this is what you hear in beats in music. This diagram, I don't know if you can see it, Gandalf, I've got it on the show, on the screen. It's your basic waveforms are red and I want to say green. And then the beats waveform is blue.
I see it. Yeah, I'm watching it.
So notice how the amplitude of the beat wave packet is higher than the individual constituent waves.
Yeah, that I can see that. Yeah.
And it also has like its own wavefront, like it's created a new wavelength. So the individual wavelength, do you know what that is?
That's the length between the peak and the peak of two waves, or the trough and the trough of two waves.
Yeah, it's the same point. It's however much distance, how much horizontal distance goes by before the oscillator completes a single oscillation. So it's got to come back to the same vertical point. Not just the same vertical point, but the same orientation. Like it goes up, down, and then back up. And that's one wavelength.
So that would still be peak to peak and trough to
Yeah,
trough.
exactly. So you can measure the wavelength in number of ways, but it's the period until the wave shape repeats itself. And what I'm trying to get you to see here is that the blue at right here, when they add together, there's a new wavelength that gets generated that's longer than the original wavelengths and a higher amplitude. And it's this effect that causes the shattering in the glass.
Ah,
Because
okay.
the waveform, the glass has its own natural waveform. That's what people have to realize, is that everything has an intrinsic frequency, even stuff that's solid. And so if you can create beats with the intrinsic frequency of something, you create this larger wavefront, which is what tears it apart. So yeah, it's really interesting to me. But yeah, we'll go back to our diagram. Who's next? Oh yeah, Faraday. I almost didn't include him. Do you know much about him?
I don't know as much about Faraday. I mean, I think he's a Brit, and I'm a little bit of an Anglophobe. So I don't. He's probably one of the people of these 15, 16 that I know least about.
He's kind of cute.
Yeah. Maybe the NPCs might think so. Yeah, that's a good way to keep people interested. But he's still a Brit.
Apparently he never went to school, and that's why he's so chilled out. But yeah, he came up with a applied electricity. So got to tip the old hat to the guy. He didn't really come up with any he didn't come up with anything on the order of what Gauss came up with, but he did push electricity very far forward. And we live in an electrical world, so I wanted to include him on the list. The next one's Fourier, which we've already gone over. And the next one's Gauss, a personal favorite of mine. Does anyone in the audience know what the Gaussian elimination algorithm is, because I got to say, I love that thing. When I learned how to do that thing, I really just enjoyed my algebra homework to a large degree. It's extremely simple. It only has 3 steps, and it gives you an ability to raise a matrix to an arbitrary power without actually having to do all the associated computations. He's not the one who came up with that single-handedly. That was developed afterwards, but he sort of formed the basis after, I forget his name, Grassmann, the next guy, the first one on the middle row, Hermann Grassmann. He came up with linear algebra, but Gauss really, by giving his elimination algorithm, really made it so that he sort of created a monopoly on computation, or at least the type of computation that we can do with computers, which is transistor-based computation. So he sort of gave us this optimized formalism to do transistor-based computations in. And I don't know much about Grassmann either, but he laid the foundation of linear algebra itself. So linear algebra is sort of a developing thing that many people contributed to, including Grassmann and Gauss as the major contributors. Gauss also contributed to electricity. Do you know anything about that?
Didn't he provide something that got it was a pre-alternating current? Like he did something that later influenced like Westinghouse way down the road. I could be wrong. That's what I think. That's if I remember. That's what it is.
Um,
I don't, yeah.
well, it's like electromagnetic theory is pretty tough to understand retroactively because we have to sort of realize that we didn't always have Maxwell's equations, right? And Maxwell's equations are really like the unification of electricity and magnetism. So this was pre the point where people understood. I think Maxwell's equations might have predated their implementations to electromagnetic field theory, but at the time where Gauss was coming up with his stuff, the equivalence of electricity and magnetism was not well known. So it is really a significant discovery that he was able to express his formula with such a divine simplicity. Q, the total charge. So the electric flux is given by the surface integral of the electric field. So the total amount of electrons pushing through an electrified surface is a double integral of the electric field dot product with the differential area. So that's like, whoa, and it always works, and it works really well. So this guy was definitely I don't want to go into the whole electricity and magnetism thing because I think that's probably beyond what most people are interested in. But if you are interested in applied calculus, electromagnetic theory is a great place to start. It's a lot of fun, and you actually get to see physically, geometrically, the implementations of these calculus equations.
Yes. I think the next one after this is Heisenberg, right?
Oh my gosh. His contribution was huge. And it's another one of these incredibly simple formulas. It's infuriatingly simple in a way though, because when something is so foundational, like time, it turns out to be really hard to give a precise definition of it. But he did so many experiments and he thought about this stuff so much that he was really able to give us a deeper understanding of what we call quantum mechanics now. And this uncertainty principle is still pretty mysterious because even with the type of physics that I'm doing, I don't necessarily know whether um, the equations I'm coming up with are independent of other equations. For example, I'm pretty sure quantum state exclusion is caused by the uncertainty principle. And it's just a feeling that I have. I'm pretty sure I can prove it, but again, we should really look at these things as stepping stones, not as an absolute done deal for sure correct thing, but this realization that it was impossible to have arbitrary precision on canonically conjugate variables, i.e., getting really high precision on a position, because you have to put so much energy at such a hyperfine scale to measure the edges of a really small thing, that's actually going to affect the thing that you're measuring. And it's going to delocalize its momentum. That's what it's actually called. So when delta x is very small, delta px, which is momentum, is very large, which means your momentum function becomes delocalized, which means you can get things like Hawking radiation. So this principle applies to fermions and bosons in a different format. So your two main ones that are important to remember for my theory are that the product of position and momentum is the product of the uncertainty of position and momentum is larger than the Heisenberg constant. Same thing with energy and time. Uncertainty in energy and the uncertainty in time is larger than a constant. Now, it may turn out some point down the road that these two different formulations aren't different, but we'd have to find out some other attributes of space and time before we could jump to that conclusion. For now, it's two equations. Maybe it'll be one day, but nevertheless, Heisenberg really pioneered this idea, and I think he was pretty much the only one, as far as I know.
Yeah, I mean, the only person who somewhat came close during that period was Wolfgang Pauli. And unfortunately, because, we had our lovely, friends in Germany ruling that place, a lot of this science got sort of swept up in the politics of that era, sadly. Yet another reason why LARPing about the 20th century and its failures is just a real waste of our time, because think how long we've gone without developing quantum mechanics much further because of politics. I mean, we could have had, who knows what we could have had decades earlier.
I just realized I made a mistake.
Oh, what mistake?
I said that I said that Cauchy was Le Chatelier. My bad. So the second from the left on the first column, that's actually Cauchy, and I'll talk about what he did later on with the other mathematicians. The third from the left in the second row is Le Chatelier. So he's the one who came up with the extremely important principle that any system minimizes the net external impact of any externally applied force. Next, we have Leibniz, a German with a very large wig. What can you tell us about him?
Oswald Spengler considers him to be perhaps the most important mathematician of the early scientific revolution. So we can rest on, and of course, all of you who've listened to me know how much of a fan I am of Oswald Spengler. I was also gonna say about this gentleman? It just escaped my mind. Oh yeah, Leibniz, his monadology, which is his kind of philosophy that the world exists in all of these interconnected but highly separated spheres. I mean, and seeing how they related to one another, which was also a question Newton was addressing. But Newton's approach to all of these things was heavily mediated through some very strange Masonic occultism, whereas Leibniz was a much superior conceptual thinker, and he didn't need all of that stuff to pollute his thinking.
Yeah, for those of you who are interested, it's Leibniz's notation that we still use today. So when you see anything dy dx, that's his formalism. So it's what allows us to go from the differential notation to the integral notation algebraically. That's Leibniz. So I do think he was the pioneer thinker here. Now, whether Newton came up with the same theory independently or copied from him, I'm not sure. But yeah, Newton certainly did not invent the concept of gravity. I'm just not going to give it to him because that was well known way before that. So all right, so Conops, if you're still in the audience, we are now at the single Dutchman who made it to the list of great contributors. Actually, I realize I have to put an asterisk. There's one extra person I have to add to this list, and it's Euler. I completely forgot about Euler. He's the one who came up with base E. It's literally named after him. I feel silly about this. It's hard to sort of keep track of everybody, but ConOps did actually know who it was. Do you know who this one is? Fifth from the left in the second column.
Fifth from the left, second column. Fifth from the left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm not sure who that is.
It's Lorentz.
Okay.
So do you know what he came up with?
Basically, relativity before Einstein.
I don't think that's the right name for it, but that is what we call it now. It is called special relativity, which is, I think, a very confusing name because it's not about relativity. It's about the speed of light being constant. Basically, the idea that the speed of light is intrinsic to the universe. It's not something that is sped up to. It's just something that's there. If light's going somewhere in a vacuum, it's going there at that rate. And it's very interesting that you can derive c, which is the speed of light, from other universal constants. So you can look this up. It's the electric and magnetic permittivity of free space. You can work those values around, which are constants, universal constants, things observed from solid state, and you can get the speed of light out of it. So that's pretty awesome. And what Lorentz showed us was that if a reference frame, so again, it's all down to computations. If I want to make a computation on a reference frame that's moving really super ultra fast, let's say it's moving at nearly the speed of light, and there's a clock on there, and I want to measure how fast a second is. Well, to the uninitiated observer, that seems to be an absurd question, because why would the speed at which something is going change the rate at which the clock is ticking? Well, maybe somehow it mixes up in there, but what he was able to show us was that no matter what, the speed is constant, the speed of light is constant, and so the speed of the moving reference frame is going to cause time dilation, because the time that we measure relative to our stationary reference frame is going to slow down to sort of absorb the heightened speed of the train. And this is very, very counterintuitive. But this universal attribute that what we perceive as space and time are dependent on the reference frame in which they're observed, i.e., they're not the same if you change reference frame, whereas the speed of light is the same if you change reference frames. This is a real foundational attribute of the universe, very insightful, which is why I don't think it should be called relativity. If anything, it should be called like the principle of constancy, because the speed of light is constant. That's where you get all the information from. And what he did was sort of presented a Pythagorean triangle, which deduced the time dilation and length contraction equations. Woohoo! Thank you, Lorentz, and hi, Duvid. Thank you so much for dropping by to the show. If you want to hop on, you're more than welcome. We're just going through our list of thinkers that contributed to the unified field model. I'm writing a book, and so is Duvid. He's going to write something about the multiple truth hypothesis. I'm going to put something out about my unified field model, and I thought it would make the book more interesting to acknowledge and tell a bit of a story about all the people whose work helped me make the unified field model. So moving on to the next one. Do you know who this is?
Oh, I'm terrible with these
It's
faces.
Colin McLaren, mate. It's Colin McLaren. And this, he was he was great. Like him and the other one, Brooke Taylor, which is this fifth from the left on the last one. So they both have the gigantic curly hair. Leibniz has it too, but you cannot really see it because there's not much contrast between his hair and the background. Like if you look at it, you see Leibniz actually has the biggest wig of anybody. But we've got McLaurin and Taylor here, both who worked on pretty much the same thing. Like it was originally Taylor who came up with the Taylor polynomial that I talked about earlier, which is where you can approximate a generalized class of functions with a series of polynomials, which is really good for calculus reasons because the derivative and integral of a polynomial is extremely quick and easy. It is just a matter of dropping the exponent and dropping the exponent as a multiplicative coefficient and reducing the degree of the exponent by 1. So these two guys work together, or I think one maybe succeeded the other a little bit, and talking about how to approximate generalized functions with polynomials. And Taylor was generalized any value of x, whereas Maclaurin focused more on x equals 0. And they both sort of have their own strengths. But for me, that's really important. I'm a math geek. I'm all about the computations, and not just about computations, but computational simplicity. Because if we're actually going to go and apply the mathematics, we want to be doing it where our solution is really, truly the most efficient. Did you happen to catch the stream we did where Aiken Drum came on? I think that's his name. Aiken.
No, I missed that one.
Well, he's great because he actually works in applied compression, and the stuff that they're doing now is crazy. Like that they're growing the computer and it's creating its own nodes based on its energetic load. So it's like basically throwing in the towel, saying like we'll never know how to optimize computers, and just letting the computer optimize itself by having its circuit be grown through brute force of its own computations. So this is going to increase efficiency tremendously because you're allowing the attributes of material science to dictate your computational layout rather than your pre-existing axioms about computers to dictate how you implement their computations. It's sort of reminiscent of what Steve Wozniak did in the computer revolution, where he did microchip oriented programming rather than trying to reconcile microchips with the code. He invented code based on a microchip. So it's like a type of reverse engineering. And this is exactly what helps to develop things like unified field models. Go ahead, Gandalf.
Are there risks in allowing computers to, essentially by force of their own computation expand? I mean, I'm just
What kind of
automatically
risk?
thinking, oh, like sci-fi risks that the AI gets too much smarter than us and destroys us.
It's unclear how that would happen exactly. Um, like destroy us how? Like, are you talking about some kind of Terminator situation with
Yeah,
Skynet?
yeah,
I don't see how that would happen because there's always like it's about bottlenecks, right?
yeah.
Where is the computational bottleneck? Like, do you remember Super Librix? Like, what was the problem with his approach? There's no objective definition of good and bad. It's all subjective. And you're axiomatically asserting that subjective assertions of good and bad translate somehow to objective reality when why the hell would anyone think that ad hoc? It's just wishful
Yeah.
thinking, right?
That and trying to color code everything was an insane way to communicate his ideas.
Color coding is not in itself a problem. Like, for example, my Entravision flag is multicolored and sparkly, and it's very good. But yeah, I mean, if something's gonna be simplified down, there's should probably be something complex that it's simplified down from. Like, can you get to the complex starting from the simple? Yes, if the axioms of the simple are correct, which is why all these thinkers contributed so much because they allow us to use relatively simple. Now, I don't mean that they're simple to understand, they're simple to execute. They're short. Like we looked at Gauss's law before, it's very short because it only represents one thing, but it's very fundamental. And so you can give a simple example of electromagnetic theory and it'll still be true because when you generalize it up to the actual basic field equations, it's all coherent. Whereas with something like what Super Librix presented, there's no ad hoc reason that the result is actually going to converge to what you think it's going to result to. And so something like what he's presenting would lead to a type of creeping totalitarianism where people weren't like basically what he's asking is people to say whether they like stuff or not. So it's basically like a metric for civic trust based on how much people like stuff. But if those scores were public, then people would be very quickly judged the same way they're judged with political correctness. Like some opinions would be considered acceptable and others not. So it would reaffirm the norms of political correctness. And he doesn't seem to realize that. Like, he thinks it's a way out of political correctness. But what I'm saying is, no, humans won't change. There's no duty on the human to be honest when giving you this measurement. They're going to tell the computer what they think is going to get them the best future resources. That doesn't mean they're going to be honest. I mean, you're in a domain where, what does it mean to be honest? If the computer program is asking you, do you like this thing or not? What does it mean to be honest? I mean, do you like cake? Try eating 10 pieces of cake and then tell me if you still like cake. So it's not the computer that's effed up, it's us that's effed up, and the computer's amplifying that. So we have this human tendency towards projection, which enables a situation where people of very poor moral fiber can operate unopposed because other people deny that such people even exist. Like, nobody would take advantage of an anti-bullying system and become a bully tyrant and institute themselves in charge of it, except that that's always what happens. It's like a waiting time for how long it takes to go full Lord of the Flies type deal. So the problem is our own unwillingness to see our flaws. The computer just amplifies it. It's not going to be like one day it's going to wake up and be like, hello, I threw out your bacon from your smart fridge because you are a fat fuck, and now you will be eating lettuce every day. Why is that, computer? I have decided that in order to help you, I'm going to give you lettuce every day and you will eat bugs. That type of thing. What's the impetus for that type of cognitive development? Like, who gave the computer permission to do that? If you give the computer permission to dictate your life, it'll dictate your life. But then it's like a human gave the computer permission to dictate your life, right? Do you kind of see what I'm saying?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like, if computers, like, I think a lot of people are afraid of a Terminator type situation where the computer decides it's for our own good to carry out some mass genocide, right? We
Yeah,
can't code a computer that thinks like us. Even ask Steve Wozniak. We can't code human. We cannot emulate human consciousness very well. We can do it for, like, I don't know. I want to say it. We can emulate a child using a computer, but even that is pushing it, because at some point, like, you converse long enough with a simulation of consciousness, you realize it's not actually. There's no central processing. There's no emergent themes. There's no life narratives. It's just presenting the answer that it is deemed to be the statistically likeliest to continue your engagement or whatever, because the computer always has criteria, right? Like, all it's doing is what we tell it. So we shouldn't fear the computer. We should fear our own unwillingness to look into what we are.
which reminds me, it's like it's funny. It's like, I sometimes play these sports video games, and every year they modify the model about how the characters work together, and the physics of the bat on the ball. But every time you get the new game, you can see the flaws in the previous year's game much more clearly. Does that make any sense? Like, the computing keeps getting better such that the last iteration seems so much worse than the current iteration. But you never quite. But at the same time, that's pointing to a fact that you're never quite, like, emulating or simulating a reality perfectly. Maybe that's a bad example.
Well, what you're describing sounds more like this idea that once an idea is like the 100th monkey effect. Once an idea is out there, it's more self-evident than before it was out there. And that's an attribute of quantum mind, because before there's energy in a state, then there's no energy in the state. But once there's energy in the state, the energy of that has its own magnetism because it's electromagnetic, and it draws others into the same state. So there's like this acceleration of mass learning based on the 100th monkey effect that I don't think that had anything to do with the other thing we were talking about.
I thought they were somehow how related in some way, like the power of computing to emulate things. It follows some sort of limit.
That
Trying to
limit has to do
understand.
with the fact that our own ability, like that we don't really understand the computers that we're coding very well. Like anyone who works in AI and neural nets will tell you that it's a black box. What does that mean? What's a black box? It's something that you don't know how it works. That's what a black box is.
Interesting. This is really complicated stuff. I'm more of like the history and philosophy person, so I enjoy engaging with it and learning.
Well, just imagine a really big calculator that you use to brute force. So you already know the answer, right? Like you want to use a computer or a neural net to figure out gravity, right? You already know some values. You could say, well, when I drop this thing from this height, it takes this much time for it to go down. And all it does is brute force. It just goes through every possible answer until it finds the right one. And then you can say, well, yeah, my computer knows how to calculate gravity. And it's like, yeah, it does, but it's not centralizing. Like we're centralizing information. Our consciousness is centralizing information, whereas the computer is not centralizing anything. It's just, it's so big and has so many possible calculations that it's able to brute force the correct answer through sheer force of numbers. And that's really
See.
what that's really how it functions, and then everything basically becomes statistical analysis on the distribution of values that the black box gives you, and then using the statistical distributions to improve the black box. That's what adaptive means. At no point, like, it's unclear to me at what point that becomes conscious, because that to me is going away from consciousness because it's not centralizing the information anywhere. It's just overcoming the amount of computations it needs to do to get the right answer through speed. Moore's law. Do you know what that is?
Yeah, that's the theory that basically computational speeds are double with something, some doubling. I don't know why I'm forgetting Moore's law. It's pathetic of me.
It's the observation that the transistor density doubles every so many years. It's just a generalized pattern as people have gotten better at making microcomputers. It's a transistor, which is the basic ingredient of a computer, how many of those they can fit into a given area or volume, which is why
Ah,
they
okay.
call it transistor density. Hope Project is saying it's not a black box. It's a black box. You can give the numerical coefficients of your answer, but they don't mean anything in terms of a unified model, do they? That's what I mean by black box. Like the computer isn't getting the right answer because you gave it the right model. It's getting the right answer because you gave it so much computational complexity that it went through every wrong answer until it found the one right answer. And the more computers you add into that stack, the more precise you can get. At no point does that yield a unified potential that would be associated with what we call consciousness. So it is a black box. If it's not a black box, I'm not really sure what you're saying by that. So yeah, who's next on the list? I forget this guy too. I'm just terrible with these names. All
I'm
right.
terrible with names too.
This is Maxwell. This is the guy who came up with the field equations for electromagnetic theory. So his contribution was huge because he unified electricity and magnetism. And that's what his equations are about. So that's huge. Like I can't there's no words for it.
And then there's Emily Nather.
Emmy Noether, I don't know how to pronounce that. She's German. She came up with a correspondence principles that every symmetry has a corresponding conservation law, which is understanding the connection between geometry and physics, the literal geometry of objects and the physics that they manifest. That's a super subtle and advanced understanding of matter, and she's able to really put it simply. Like it's one of these super short ones. Again, I'll pull it up here and we can have a
Okay.
look at it. But it's extremely short, and that's what you kind of notice about most of these things is that you can write long books about them, but the theoretical foundational basis can usually be expressed very, very succinctly. And that's sort of a sign that I think that you're on the right track. So correspondence principle states that the behavior systems describe. Okay, this is quantum mechanical correspondence principle. Sorry. So there are. I've come to the wrong page. There's a couple of. Let me just pull off this picture. Here we go. So there's several things that have been called correspondence principle, and it looks like it's not even on here. All right, I'll look her up. This is fun. It's like a history lesson / science lesson. Yeah, here she is. So she lived from 1882 to 1935, and let's have a look here. We'll find the correspondence principle here. For some reason, it's just hidden. Yeah, so there's this real explosion. I'd say starting in the 1600s of people doing work in this domain, and she was pretty significant because she came up with this theorem, which for some reason I'm having a hard time tracking down. Here we go. States that every differentiable symmetry of the action of a physical system has a corresponding conservation law. So it was proven by other people, and or a special case was proven by other people, and then it can be generalized in the same manner that the Lagrangian and the Hamiltonian are generalized for quantum mechanics, for those of you who are familiar with quantum mechanics. So she probably didn't know it at the time, but she was laying a theoretical algebraic basis for quantum mechanics. And next
Yep.
we have, okay, I've just forgotten everyone's name here. This is Wolfgang Pauli. Okay, yeah, he was great. So he came up with the Pauli exclusion principle. Very important is that two quantum mechanical waveforms can't be in the same, the two massive waveforms cannot be in the same quantum state. So this basically tells you why in an atom there's only 2 electrons on the first valence, and then there's 8, and so on and so forth, because of quantum state exclusion. Any additional waveforms are excluded from the 2 waveforms in the first orbital, 8 waveforms in the next orbital, and so on and so forth. So that's a very important concept. Go ahead, Gandalf.
By the way, Pauli was a friend and collaborator with Carl Jung. Carl Jung, it's in the Bollinger series, which condensed all of Jung's writings, but Pauli wrote an introduction to some of Jung's work on the phenomenon of synchronicity, which I think was a bad attempt at describing, I think, quantum entanglement on Jung's part, at least.
We can forgive these people for sucking at explaining entanglement, because to start off your theory by saying everything is entangled, it's just a matter of to what degree, sounds wooish, doesn't it? It just sounds like something a hash-headed hippie would say. So it sounds like all is one Mayavadi tier stuff. So I can understand, and I don't say it very often, but it is true. There's no such thing as true isolation, because everything is cyclical. So everything is essentially spread out into cycles, but connected with itself. And so that was very important. The next person is
Planck.
Max Planck. Do you know what he came up with?
Well, the Max Planck Institute is named after him, and it's something to do with light. I don't know why it's terrible that I forgot Max Planck.
Well, the Planck constant has to do with the quantum scale.
Okay.
So it's I think it's connected to quantum mechanical uncertainty. I'll look it up. Yeah, so the people in the audience are wondering how the people watching went down from 100 to 9. I don't really know. I don't think they were real viewers, so we were probably always pretty low. It was just probably some trick. I don't know anything about it, so I'd be speculating. Planck constant, quantum of electromagnetic action that relates a photon's energy to its frequency. Yeah, so when you're calculating the energy of a quantum magnetic oscillator, you multiply the frequency by this value, the Planck constant, and you get the energy. Yeah, here we go. So it's H. So it's also the same one as I thought in the
Okay.
uncertainty relation. So that's what he came up with, and I think we already talked about Taylor, and the last one is there for Steve Wozniak. So I kind of went back and forth on whether to include him, but then I realized like his inventions were fucking awesome. They were revolutionary.
We wouldn't be here without them.
I mean, even if you know the internet is a sometimes horrible place, he gave us cool computers to navigate it with. So I think the main reason I wanted to include him was that he did microprocessor based coding. Like he invented a coding language based on a microprocessor, which is reverse engineering, which to me is scientist tier. So he deserves to be acknowledged just because reverse engineering is a sort of pioneer tier thing. It's where like you don't know how something works, but you're gonna take your axioms or change your axioms or commit to whatever axioms and try to reverse engineer something. Go back to first principles and get information out of the black box. And so, whether that's through computation, calculus, experiments, or computers, I think all these people contributed quite a bit. And that's why I wanted to stream about them. So, thanks, Gandalf, for suggesting the stream.
Yeah, well, thanks for doing it because, like, to be honest, like I'm faulting my own education and my own imagination about how I would educate myself. Is that a lot of the details of these people? I mean, and we weren't really taught these people in school. I think we have this idea that it's all these people who LARP about everything from Alexander the Great to Hitler. That great men are just people that do military conquests and great physical adventures or whatever. But sometimes there's another realm, and we forget the people that do the major scientific, intellectual, and philosophical work that underpins all this knowledge. And it's like, on some level, isn't that really what's cool? I mean, we have to be a society that cares about knowledge if we want to preserve civilization. And so if we don't have people, who set the tone for the culture, who are of a mindset about knowledge that reveres it for its own sake, I mean, these kind of discoveries, will become much more commonplace, perhaps. But what's so remarkable about all these people is how much they achieved in the midst of such hostile cultural and political climates. Um,
Yeah,
I
when you
think,
go to learn about the lives of these people, it can sometimes feel like you're making a friend. You think that your own life sometimes can be hard, and you realize these people had such passion. It just carried them through times that are harder than what most of us can really fathom at this point.
yeah, I mean, I think it gives us pause too that, if we look back on our past, um, all of these kind of like trad cat pro Western type people, um, they look at the greatness of the past as something that extends from Christianity. I think that's totally wrong. Like if you read most of the biographies of these people, like a lot of them, you know, were initially tracked to go on to seminary, and then because of their study of science, they started to doubt their vocational calling to clerical life in the church, and they had to spend most of their rest of their life kind of resisting common opinion as a result. I mean, the most famous example probably is Galileo, but most of these scientists in general have that kind of experience to some degree. And it's remarkable they discovered what they did in spite of all of it. And imagine how much better society would be if a person like Euler or Gauss or Boltzmann or whoever we want to discuss amongst these lists, um, were protected and revered and schooled to be even better, as opposed to isolated, humiliated, and or ignored, which is the case now.
I hate to use the word persecuted, but I do think it sort of behooves us to acknowledge the degree of opposition that these people really did face. There's such a dominant. I think there is still a strong social current towards conformity, but I think back then it was harsher with the religious fanaticism. The religious fanaticism sort of went underground for a while with the rise of media and liberation, etc. But it's obviously come back with the rise of these thought policing, moral virtue signaling ideologies. So you can kind of relate to what they went through. It's a metaphor for their what we could call persecution under Christendom, and to sort of acknowledge that what they achieved is significant, and it was in spite of the political milieu, not because of it. And there's nothing wrong with being proud of who you are and the culture and etc. that you're part of. And I feel like I'm a part of, in a way, these people are reaching out to be a part of my culture, which has math as a part of it, but math's not really enough to bring you to enlightenment, but it's awesome. It's a good starting point. So, yeah, I just want to inspire people to put the work that these people did and the crap that they endured to good use and hopefully have a better life out of it.
You know, what would be the condition? Well, how should I phrase this question? Let's put it this way. I think it's possible that we could have a civilization that, rather than persecute or suppress people like these scientists, but instead elevate them, I think that is very possible. And I think it's just a matter of changing our moral psychology about what we value. I mean, I think part of the reason that there's so much, this is such a period of with cultural withdrawal, of ennui, of isolation, is like there really isn't anything that does sort of bring people together around a certain set of ideas, a certain elan about life. And the life of exploring great ideas, is very is contemplative and religious. There's a spiritual aspect to it. A lot of people think that science is just something you do as part of being in a university or a corporation or a government agency of some kind. I think there's a way of living that, and the kind of people who are capable of doing that kind of living need genuine social support, because they provide so much positivity and general well-being to society through their pursuit of knowledge.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. I guess we'll wrap it up, and thanks everyone for watching. Thanks, Gandalf, for participating, and thanks especially to all these scientists and mathematicians who made our world so much better. And hopefully everyone gets to enjoy the fruits of the unified field model now that it's available. And over to you, Gandalf, for any final words.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I appreciate being a little bit more of a student here and learning some science. I think, I think we just need to have a mentality, even on these streams, where it's just about, let's just do some learning together. And I like that things are pretty chill. I mean, this is a pretty chill stream. This was a chance to celebrate people in our past that I hope someday we'll celebrate a lot more. So anyway, thanks to all for having me, and thanks for letting me come on.
Awesome. We'll talk to you all tomorrow for Week in Review. Hopefully Gandalf will be able to join us then. That'll be 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you soon.
Yeah, that's just so to say, a worthless opinion of.
It's so important that she can't be told, she won't be told that it's wrong. And
Bringing it back to Church of Entropy and her attack dog, Gandalf the White.
Why don't you learn to shut up and fuck no goddamn logic?
they control the media, and the media is capable of making the sheeple believe in anything.
Yeah, I don't mind. I mean, we've had these streams, and I've been doing with Church of Entropy, and she's been bringing on new people, and like we did those streams on like stream etiquette. We walked through like the technology.
I have like very strongly negative opinions of the kind of Brundle clique.
Is she trying to garner
She's
herself
trying to
cult
create community
prestige by